Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be dispelling some of the myths that many people think about the Death Knight in classic Wrath of the Lich King. By the way guys, if you haven't already, please give me a quick follow on Twitch. You'll find that in the description down below. But anyway, let's jump into the video. So the first big myth is that Death Knights are brain dead and really easy class to play. Okay, I think what's happening here is it's a similar case to Hunters in the Burning Crusade. Everyone thought Hunters are going to be an absolute doddle in the Burning Crusade. You just spam one button macro and that's it, Bob's your uncle. But it in fact turned out that the Hunters were a little bit more complicated than people thought because there were so many sneaky little tricks that you could do to boost your DPS. And I think the same goes for Death Knights. I'm not saying by any means that they are a drastically complicated class, but they are more difficult to master than most people will think. I think the conception that Death Knights are brain dead is largely because of the fact that one, they start at level 55, they get a much easier time. Out of the bat, they are absolutely decked out in really good blue gear that's nearly equal to like tier 2 classic raid gear. And obviously on the launch of Wrath of the Lich King, they were ludicrously overpowered, as I've shown in a previous video. More on that later. But Death Knights changed dramatically in Wrath of the Lich King's lifetime. With every patch, it really felt like they were getting nerfed. And in the final 3.3.5 version that we will get in Classic Wrath, they are much less powerful than technically the 3.08 version. So let's start with the Frost Death Knight. The rotation is definitely fairly simple. Okay, you keep dots up, you consume your runes of Obliterate, Runic Power of Frost Strike, you use Howling Blast on Rhyme procs, which makes it cost no runes. You keep your death runes up by using Pestilence and Bloodstrike here and there, and the Pestilence will refresh both diseases with a glyph that you use. It is a fairly normal, simple, cyclic rotation, but the thing that people don't understand about Frost Death Knight is you literally have to use an ability every single global cooldown. If you're not using an ability every global, you're losing DPS. You are constantly mashing buttons. There really isn't any downtime. And then you obviously have to be extremely responsive to procs so that you don't accidentally waste DPS by using the wrong ability. You've got to react accordingly to Pestilence actually missing the target. There's different mini rotations for when you have to switch targets. All the meanwhile, you have to be very responsive to mechanics. So again, it's very simple and easy to pick up. You can figure it out in the space of about 5 minutes, but it requires so much alertness and precision to top the logs in a raiding environment. And Holy DK is absolutely no different. Basically, take on board everything I've said about the Frost Death Knight, like having to do something every global cooldown, and then add another layer of complexity, which is dot and gargoyle snapshotting. Long story short, I've talked about this before, you can refresh your dots before certain procs are going to fall off, so that they continue to benefit from that buff damage. It needs enough attack power to be justified, which is normally going to be something like a big beefy trinket proc. Now, the Gargoyle also snapshots your current stats when you pop it. It particularly benefits from haste. It's why some DKs, when it's viable to pop Gargoyle in the opener, they normally, but only if Bloodlust will also be popped in the opener, open the fight in Unholy Presence and then pop back over to Blood Presence with a Blood Tap. You can even take this even further by quickly popping the Gargoyle with a Crowd Pummeler from Nomeron popped, if you want to try hard that a little bit more. One of the issues with how procs works in Wrath is, well, it doesn't work how we do in retail. Basically, long story short, in retail, the longer a proc hasn't occurred, whether it's from a trinket or Rune of the Fallen Crusade or anything, the more likely it will pop. Which is why all your procs normally always pop in the opener when you're playing retail. But it's not like that in Wrath of the Lich King. So it can be rather irritating because you'll open a fight and it'll take 30 seconds, even longer maybe, for your trinket to proc, and some of them only proc off crits as well, which is even more irritating. So a lot of it is down to RNG of setting up a number of different procs at once from a trinket, and then an unused trinket, Rune of Fallen Crusader, Desolation, everything like that. But sometimes you just get really, really bad RNG and your procs just don't line up and sync up together, and therefore you have to pop a mediocre Gargoyle instead. And the thing you need to remember about a Blood Death Knight is that they don't actually have a shield or bear form. They do have Frost Presence, which is nice, but this means that they take a lot of damage. This isn't usually a problem because you're just constantly self-healing with your Death Strikes and other abilities like Blood Parasites, but Sometimes you need to prioritise generating aggro, whether that's on the boss, that's going to be less likely in Wrath, but sometimes you need to generate a lot of AoE aggro. You need to prioritise using your runes on Blood Boil and Death and Decay in order to actually hold that aggro, but then sometimes you can really get caught off guard because then you have absolutely no runes left for your Death Strikes. So you pulled over mobs, take loads of extra damage, you got the aggro, but now you have absolutely no Death Strikes. If you don't have anything like Empower Rune Weapon, you know, off the cooldown, then guess what, Sunshine? You are bang in trouble because you can't heal yourself. That will happen to quite a few new Death Knights. It definitely isn't an absolute cakewalk Blood Death Knight tanking. You've got to be careful not to totally exhaust your runes to the point where you can't Death Strike and actually heal yourself back up to full health in certain situations. Sometimes you're fine because you've got like 6 healers popping off heals on you, but you're not always going to have that luxury. If you decide to play Death Knight, you will realise that there is actually a bit of work you've got to do to truly master the class. You can't just rock up, press buttons, and that's it. You know, it's definitely no Destruction Warlock in TBC where you just spam Shadow Bolt and pray for RNG. It's nowhere near that low level of complexity. And another big misconception about Death Knights is that they are way too overpowered. Well, Death Knights were stupidly overpowered in early Wrath of Lich King, but like I said before, they got nerfed a lot. They're still a top tier class, don't get me wrong, but if we're looking at private server numbers, they actually fall short of many other classes most of the time. They won't be on top of the logs for the absolute start to finish Wrath of Lich King, maybe in the Trial of the Crusader. Evan and Holy will probably dominate the logs on certain AoE fights, but they are actually a little bit worse than other classes in the game. And to be honest, across the board, in Wrath of Lich King, many of the classes are fairly more balanced than what we're used to. For instance, comparing a Shadow Priest to a Destruction Warlock in the Burning Crusade, the gap between the power and DPS of those two specs is going to be shortened in Wrath of Lich King. But when it comes to PvP, every intelligent arena player knows that a true overpowered class is actually quite rare, because every class has a weakness and a way to counter it, and a comp or a class that counters it quite hard. A Death Knight's weakness is the fact that Gargoyle, the pet, and himself, when he uses Lichborn, count as an undead. This means a Holy Paladin can use Turn Evil on the Gargoyle and totally nerf a lot of its damage, or Fear the Death Knight if he doesn't remove Lichborn in time. The reason why I didn't mention the Shackle Undead here, obviously the priest ability, is because there's no way to argue against this. Death Knights just stomp on priests. The Death Knights definitely have some good utility in the arena, but other classes definitely have more. They're good at peeling melee with their Chains of Ice, but obviously this isn't as effective against a range DPS. Comps that are range and utility heavy will counter those Death Knight comps that rely on overwhelming the enemy with their damage like TSG and Shadowcleave. Because obviously when the Death Knight is CC'd, he can't deal his pressure. So when classes have a lot of spammable CC, like Polymorph, then the Death Knight will start to fall behind. Well, his arena team will start to fall behind because the Death Knight relies so much on its damage rather than its utility. But I'm not going to lie, the TSG comp can be very, very hard to counter if your comp doesn't have good peels for the melee, because it has 8 ways to prevent the healer from casting, 50% damage absorption, a silence, and just insane damage. In fact, even if a healer was able to hardcast his heals without a Death Knight or the warrior interrupting him, he wouldn't be able to out-heal the damage of a warrior and a Death Knight. I think because of how many Death Knights dominate low level at level 58 in BGs and out in the open world because they have all that really powerful gear, people think Death Knights are much stronger than they actually are. A brain-dead toddler headbutting his keyboard can overwhelm anyone in low-level PvP when they jump out of the start zone, but you actually have to have some level of skill to push Gladiator, and obviously a much deeper understanding of how arena works and how other classes work in order to counter them and stop yourself from getting countered. So, overall, Death Knights, they are very overpowered, but definitely not the strongest class in Wrath. They're definitely not as simple and as straightforward as you have been led to believe by, let's be honest, probably bitter players who have been owned too many times by a Death Knight. But anyway guys, that's going to be the end of the video there. My name is MetaGoblin. To the next video, ciao.